friend. Welcome back to This Is How We Create. My name is Martine Severin, your host. I am so glad that you're here. I am currently 6 years into creating this podcast. And that means that this is nearly 200 episodes that we've recorded over those 6 years. And I kept catching myself measuring my work against these invisible standards I couldn't even name, no matter how much journaling I did. So some of these would have been like, should I have more downloads by now? Or should I have landed that big guest by now? Or am I even doing this thing right? And then I'd look at my creative practice, this thing that I had built. And instead of seeing what I had made, all I could see was the gap between where I am and where I thought I should be. So it's all super exhausting, right? And if I'm not reading something that's reorganizing my brain, I get restless. I read so many books a week, I'm telling you. And so there are 4 books now, though, that have been doing that. They've helped me become less restless. And so I am so happy to share them with you because each of them has given me a way of noticing how I've been operating in someone else's framework without even noticing it. So today I'm sharing these 4 books with you. They're not necessarily a reading list, but they have helped me so tremendously. And I've been playing, so I've been playing by other people's rules rather than my own, or if even the rules that I thought I had created, they weren't truly my own. This episode is brought to you by iCode. Every child starts as a creator. They imagine stories, build worlds, and ask big questions. But as they grow up, creativity can take a backseat to routine and screens. That's where iCode comes in. Through after-school STEM activities, iCode's programs give kids a space to create again. Visit icodeschool.com to book a free trial. So the first book is Crafted Kinship, Inside the Creative Practice of Contemporary Black Caribbean Makers. And this is by Melanie Barnett. So Melanie was on the show a while back, specifically in episode 93, I think. And she was working on a book profiling over 60 Caribbean makers. And when this book arrived, I pre-ordered it, of course. And I thought I would flip through it. I would appreciate the photography, but something else unexpected happened. I started reading about Terry Bodie, who is a photographer from St. Kitts and Nevis. So he said, we have to leave signs for the next generation to follow through our work. And I thought, wait, is that what I'm doing through this podcast? Is that what I am doing? Am I leaving signs behind? Am I building an archive of voices that might otherwise disappear? And the answer is yes. I always had this idea of doing it, and I'm glad that this is the case. Now comes Diane Smith, a fiber artist from Belize, but who works out of her apartment in Harlem. So Diane talks about how her practice is a dance between herself and her materials and learning how to control that and all the while letting her materials guide her. So 6 years in, I can't believe it, 6 years into doing this podcast, I am finally learning the same dance. Then there is LeVar Monroe, who is in Baltimore, and LeVar describes his painting process like making music. We're talking about tones, melodies, and rhythms. And his studio itself is filled with materials that he's gathered from the Bahamas and from his travels. And I'm like, oh, okay. So this is kind of like with the podcast as well, because each conversation is kind of like a material that I can use and put in my archive. Then I read the story of Anita Major. Now, Anita, she is braiding ceramic sculptures that are inspired by her grandmother's basketry, which is a technique carried by enslaved Africans over to the Caribbean. And so she says that there's this cultural memory that she has in her work that is all about survival. So there are these 60 artists in this book that are not waiting for the American art world to validate them. They're not even waiting to get to fit into the MoMA's definition of actually what matters. What they are doing is they're practicing their art, and they're building their own systems, they're building their own archives, and they're building their own infrastructure for just remembering. And I realized that I've been measuring my podcast against American media standards. So I compare myself to NPR, to the New York Times, or whatever legitimate version is supposed to look like, at least for the podcast. But what if those weren't even my standards? What if, like these Caribbean makers, I'm building something that really doesn't need validation to matter? Something to consider. So that question really stopped me in my tracks. It really did. And so I keep mulling over it and journaling over it. So the second book in the series that I want to talk to you about is a book called The Gap and the Gain by Dan Sullivan and Dr. Benjamin Hardy. So we've mentioned this book before in a past episode, but let's talk about that voice in your head that says, I should have done more. That's going to be the gap. The should, that's the gap. That's the space where you think that you should be, right? And I think that I, like many others, have been living in this gap. So in terms of the podcast, we're talking about 6 years, 200 episodes, and all I could think about was I should have more listeners. I should have monetized better. I should have landed bigger guests. And you know what they say, you shouldn't should have all over yourself, right? Living in the gap takes away your agency. You're measuring yourself against some external ideal that keeps moving further away the closer you get to it. It's a lose-lose. This book has taught me that measuring backwards might actually be a better way to go forward, right? So where was I 6 years ago? I probably didn't have a podcast. I didn't have a newsletter. I didn't have a community of artists and listeners. I had none of that. If I measure from there to here to now, I've built something substantial. And that's the gain. But there is one part that really got me, and it's the story of Trevor Lawrence. So this example is how Trevor Lawrence, he's a quarterback, and he is completely committed to excellence. But he's not really attached to the excellence. He's not attached to needing success to feel okay about himself, because, he's already happy. And the success that he's working towards, he doesn't need it to feel complete. You can have this intense commitment to your goals and have a healthy detachment from needing those goals to happen. So I'm building this podcast and I still want it to grow. I want it to reach more people and I want it to matter. But I don't need it to become NPR for me to be happy right now. I can be completely happy and content with where I am while still having a vision for where I'm going. And it feels really nice, because that shift from living in the gap to recognizing the gain, that really stops so much exhaustion and so much negative self-talk. So if you're thinking about, I should have done more by now, well, why not try it this way? Try looking backwards from where you started to where you are now. That's going to be your gain. And your gain is going to be probably bigger than you think. Next, I'm so happy to talk to you about this book. This book is called Decolonizing Language and Other Revolutionary Ideas by Guji Wa Tiongo. So this book I read while I was in college at Wellesley College. And this book made me uncomfortable then, and it still makes me uncomfortable now. And that's really good, because it asks questions such as, why do we produce our intellectual work in the colonizer's language? Why is African literature written in English or in French instead of language from a current tribe like in Swahili or maybe even in Yoruba? In Haiti, why is intellectual work often done in French instead of in Creole? And for me, why am I conducting this podcast episode in English instead of in Creole or even in French, right? Those are all languages I speak. Creole, I still speak Creole day to day, but I don't know if this is necessarily about switching language. I think the question is about understanding whose framework am I operating through and without even realizing it. So not just language, but the definitions of what does a professional mean? Whose standards of good creative am I using? And whose ideas about what success looks like or what a good podcast sounds like? And I've been trying to sound legitimate by American public radio standards. Diction is important. We know that. This American life's pacing and trying to do everything the right way. But what if that's not really my way? What if the way that I speak and the natural rhythms that I have, what if that's not less, but just different? This book, y'all, it does not give you answers. It will give you a whole lot more questions than you think you had. But what is beautiful about it is how it helps me understand and appreciate the fact that this is all really messy and that we should take time to question the frameworks in which we are working, because sometimes the frameworks might not be working for us. So the next book I want to talk with you is All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, But Some of Us Are Brave. Now, this book has been edited by Akasha Gloria Hall and Patricia Bell Smith and Barbara Smith. This book came out in 1982. And while I was not living in the US at that time, what this book, I think it's more important than ever because it named for me something. If the Black man's experience is double consciousness, being Black and being American, then the Black woman's consciousness is probably quad consciousness, right? Because we're Black, we are women, and we're navigating race and gender and class and sexuality all at once. None of those identities exist separately. They're all happening simultaneously. The feminist movement is an interesting one because the feminist movement wanted to talk about gender as if race doesn't exist, or the Black liberation movement wanted to talk about race as if gender didn't matter. And Black women were standing there saying, but we're both. You can't separate these two. I have spent years trying to fit into frameworks that weren't necessarily built for me. Now we know there were white feminist spaces where my Blackness was supposed to be secondary, or there were Black creative spaces where my womanhood was supposed to be incidental. And for those of us who don't identify either as male or female, what if, for those of us who are queer or non-binary, these questions become really difficult to answer. And you have to kind of figure out how to navigate these spaces and to understand what frameworks you're operating in. And so for a long time, I always felt like I was translating myself, like I was editing parts of my experience out, and I was editing those experiences to fit into conversations. Michelle Wallace, in her essay, says that there's basically little hope for a Black feminist movement, maybe some minimal hope for a multicultural one, but mostly this is an individual fight, right? And I feel that. And it's so true, because when you think about what we're doing as artists, in my case, I'm building a podcast for artists of color, but I'm also deeply shaped by my experiences as a Haitian and as with all of the different backgrounds that I have. And these backgrounds aren't things that you can peel apart. They're so woven tight, right? And so this book, none of these books, right? They don't solve anything. It just names things. And sometimes naming is enough, because sometimes you need to know the first thing you're experiencing. And oftentimes you're experiencing this impossibility of fitting into any single category. And that has nothing to do with failure. It has to do with the fact that people have been writing about this for decades. Multicultural people, Black people, nothing is wrong. Women, I should say as well. Queer people have been writing about this. Nothing about this is inherently wrong. It just is. And so if it is, what do we do with it? Now, I don't have the answer, and I don't know if you have the answer either. But we do know that a lot of spaces weren't designed for us. And so trying to fit in or trying to be legitimate or practicing identity politics. Sometimes that feels like it's a fool's errand. But these 4 books, as I mentioned, they didn't give me answers, but they sure pointed out a lot of permission. They gave permission slips. So Creative Kinship showed me about validation and about what kind of infrastructure of my own I can create. The Gap and the Gain showed me to stop looking forward and think about looking more backwards to see what I've been built. And the one thing that sticks with me about decolonizing language is just the way that I say my name. I introduce myself as Martine Severin when truly I am Martine Severin. You have to decide how you're introducing yourself. I've been thinking about going back to Martine Severin. All the women are white showed me the frameworks, they just weren't built for you. So trying to fit into those frameworks, like I said, fool's errand. But maybe you're in the same place 6 years in. Are you wondering if you're doing it right? Are you measuring yourself against invisible standards that you can't even name? But here's what I want you to know. If those 60 Caribbean artists can build thriving practices outside the American art world, well, maybe you can too. If they can create their own systems, their own work of meaning, of memory, maybe you can too. Maybe you don't have to wait for permission. Maybe you don't have to fit in. Maybe you can measure backwards. Maybe you can recognize your own gain and you can keep building. That's all I have for you for this episode. Thank you so much for being here, my friend. Until next time, stay creative.
Hi there. If you're loving this show, would you mind taking a quick second to leave us a 5-star review on your favorite go-to podcast app? While you're at it, subscribe to our Substack newsletter, Creative Matters. You can find the link to subscribe in the show notes. All right, that's all that I have for you today. Bye.